Great. So the focus for today will be specifically on currency, trade, and debt in debating. These are topics that people generally tend to struggle with. By that, I mean people tend to have some grasp of what, say, monetary policy is, what fiscal policy is. Uh, Maybe people know the basics of how interest rates function. But then when you need to put this all together, when you have more complex topics about, say, the investment that third world or developing countries should be making, or the reliance on certain currencies, the role of the dollar in trade and whatnot, people tend to struggle. This is especially the case when it comes to majors, as most majors do have at least 1 to 2 rounds in the preliminary rounds, which are about currency unions, for example, or something related to that. So this is good to know. And then, of course, when you get into the out rounds, there always tends to be a motion on, say, the role of the IMF or on the presence of the dollar. So these are the types of motions that I am talking about. I can go through them very briefly. So everyone should take a look and think of kind of what parts of the motions would you be comfortable with, and which parts would you struggle with. So the first motion here is about the Pacific Alliance, and it's a currency union motion, which was present in one of the preliminary rounds in Madrid Worlds 2023. Again, the second motion is another currency motion about the African Union having a common currency. These were quite popular a couple of years back. The third motion was a motion during Euros, a motion opposing deficit financing in developed democracies. And then the fourth motion is a currency motion. So it's about the kind of global dominance of the yuan compared to the, I guess, global dominance of the dollar, as that is the likely comparison. Again, not necessarily the case. You can have different comparisons. I'm going to use the laser pointer to kind of direct your focus a bit more. Again, common currency, and then lastly, a global reliance on the dollar, which was the finals of Worlds 2022. So in order to understand currency, debt, and trade, we need to start with the basics. So I'll try to call on people. If, again, you're not comfortable with being recorded, that can be cut out of from the recording. But just to kind of test your knowledge, we should take a look at your level of understanding of this. So could someone volunteer to tell me what an exchange rate is?
How much one amount of money is worth in another currency?
Correct. So for example, you could ask how much of the US dollar could you get in exchange for one British pound, and it's going to be 1 point something. Currencies can move, right? Exchange rates can move. That means the value of a currency expressed in another currency can change. Those movements are called appreciation if a currency increases in its value against another currency, or depreciation if a currency decreases in its value against another currency. So for example, those of you who have been following the news lately have seen that since Donald Trump was elected to become the US president, the US dollar appreciated against most other global currencies. And we'll kind of dig into a bit more if this is a good thing, if this is a bad thing, how you can analyze the impacts of that on various stakeholders. Trade. So here we just need to get familiar with two basic concepts, imports and exports. Could someone tell me what an import is and what an export is?
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So to my understanding, an import is just something that is purchased from a different country and brought into another country, and an export is something that one country produces and then sells on to a different country or a company within a different country.
Yep, that is exactly correct. Now, an interesting question here would be, what would you say tourism is? Is tourism an import or an export? So say, for example, people coming to, let's say, Italy to see Rome. From Italy's perspective, is tourism an import or an export? Anyone?
Is it an import?
It would be that is incorrect. It would be an export, and I've asked this on purpose because everyone, whenever kind of this subject appears, gets confused on this. It would be an export because people are essentially coming to Italy to purchase product that Italy produces, right? So Italy is essentially exporting tourism as a consequence of this. Italy is the one who is selling tourism to other people. Other people are purchasing tourism. So it is an export. Now, imports and exports and exchange rates are relatively interconnected. By that, I mean, if a country is exporting a lot more than it is importing, then that affects the demand and supply of its currency, right? Because at the end of the day, if a country is exporting, it will increase the demand for the currency of that country, right? Because eventually you will need to somehow convert it back to your domestic currency to pay your workers and all that, or maybe you just accept payment only in your own currency for your product. So if Italy exports a lot of tourism, people, assuming I'm pretty sure Italy has the euro, the last time I checked, the demand for euros will increase, right? Because people need the euros to purchase product in Italy. And then conversely, if a country is importing more than it's exporting, then it has more demand for other currencies, which means there is comparatively less demand for its own currency, and all of that affects the movements of exchange rates, right? So that's why when you hear sometimes people mention a trade deficit or a trade surplus, that has an effect long term on your exchange rate, and that's one of the reasons why these terms can become quite important. The last thing to note under trade would be tariff, as very often you have debate about tariff, supporting opposing trade wars. Definitely, I assume with kind of Trump talking a lot about putting tariffs on a bunch of countries globally, I assume you'll have more of those in the future. So a tariff is nothing but a tax on an import. Basically, if you're importing into your own country or from the perspective of another country, they're exporting to you. The importer or the country that is exporting to your country needs to pay a tax on those imports from your perspective or exports from their perspective. All right, then fiscal and monetary policy. So what's kind of the big picture difference between fiscal and monetary policy? Again, anyone, feel free to unmute yourself.
I have a
Fiscal-
feeling one's about.
Yeah, Zach, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a feeling one's about spending and one's about setting interest rates, but I can't remember which one's which.
Yeah, that big picture is basically the whole thing, correct? So fiscal policy has to do with government spending, government borrowing, and taxes, right? So fiscal policy is done by politicians that are elected democratically. That's an important aspect of it. Whereas monetary policy is usually done by people who were appointed to run central banks who aren't directly democratically accountable. And that's one point that you touch on during debates very often, because due to the fact that borrowing, spending, and taxes all happen by democratically elected or are controlled by democratically elected politicians, they might have certain incentives that differ to the more, you could say, technocratic incentives of people who oversee monetary policy. And you can argue whether that's good or bad, but a very common argument is that fiscal policy is very short-termist because politicians are elected, for 4-year-long mandates, and they don't really care about the 10, 20-year-old impacts of their policies. They only care about being reelected very soon, which means they might excessively spend and excessively borrow because they know the problems of dealing with that extra debt will be the problems of the next administration, right? And because of that, they might be incentivized to not always do the correct decision. On the other hand, you can say democratic accountability is a good thing. Why? Because being too technocratic can destroy people's lives, right? Very often when central bankers change interest rates, maybe set them high, that affects millions of people. It affects things like their credit card loans, their mortgages, their even ability to be able to get a mortgage for a house and whatnot. And that has very tangible impact on people's lives. And maybe if you're a technocrat who isn't democratically accountable, you aren't the best suited to be able to assess that, right? So there's this kind of pro and con issue with democratic accountability. So correct, monetary policy does affect interest rates. So monetary policy is performed by a central bank. That central bank does, you could say, two things largely. It does more, but usually in debates you mention these two things. One is it can lower or increase the interest rate in an economy. And an interest rate is just what you get if you save money, if you lend money, right? So if I lend someone £100 for 1 year and the annual interest rate is 5%, in 1 year they have to give me £105. And it also determines for how much you can borrow money. So if you borrow £100 for 10% interest for 1 year, in 1 year you need to repay £110. Okay, we've got a question. When debating countries like China, how should we think of this analysis if the government is more closely connected to the central bank? Perfect. This is not just China, this is also Turkey. And possibly could be the US, right? Trump has been talking increasingly about putting more pressure on the Fed and has been, in a very unprecedented way, a president who has been directly putting pressure on the Fed to keep interest rates low. So there you can, so in debates, you might think of, or in practice, the motions that you will see could be, for example, if you're talking about, say, the reliance on the dollar globally versus reliance on the yuan, you can use this, the fact that central banks in China are probably more tied to the ruling party than elsewhere. You can use this analysis to talk about the incentive of setting interest rates for that currency, and then the effect that will have globally on other countries. And we will have a lot to talk about this in more detail. So that's one use case. Or another use case is you can talk about why a more democratically accountable central banker is a good or a bad thing, right? Whether you kind of want to have this democratic mechanism more in play or less, depending on short-term versus long-term incentives, or to what extent can technocrats actually make the best decisions for the most amounts of people, because maybe they're too disconnected. So it's actually better if they are more kind of tied into the democratic process. But yeah, very, very good question. So back to interest rates. So we covered lending, borrowing. So higher interest rates make borrowing more expensive, and that has some economic effects, right? It also make saving more attractive, right? Because I don't want to spend money if I know that if I put it in a bank, it's going to give me a higher interest rate, and then I'll have more money in the future. And all of that affect both demand and supply, right? So lower interest rates tend to increase demand in the economy and also increase supply. They increase demand because people can now borrow more. Also, companies can borrow more to spend on investments. People can borrow more to spend on whatever it is, housing, other products, and whatnot. But also people are, and companies are less incentivized to save because saving now doesn't give you as high of a return. So you might as well spend the money on something. And that increases demand, right? Because when people and companies want more stuff, there's greater demand for stuff. That means things can go up in price, but also it means you probably increase employment, right? Because you need to hire people to produce those things, to provide those services that you now have more demand for. And then on the supply side, if companies can borrow more and are less incentivized to save, then you expand the capacity of an economy to supply, because companies can invest more, companies can probably offer to hire more people, and all of that provides more products and more services. And you can also say that has a bit of a deflationary effect as well. But on average, if you lower interest rates, you expect inflation to go up. And inflation, it just means the kind of general increase in prices or price levels in an economy. And then, of course, increasing interest rates does the opposite, right? When you increase interest rates, borrowing becomes more expensive because you need to repay more. Saving is more attractive now. So people spend less, companies invest less, and that has so-called contractionary effect, where demand goes down, supply can go down, inflation goes down as well, but the economy takes a hit. Usually, employment also takes a hit, so you have more unemployment. And here again, the kind of democratic accountability comes into play, because on the one hand, increasing interest rates hurts a lot of people, especially in the short term, with regards to employment, with regards to their debts. On the other hand, in the long term, it reduces high inflation, right? And that can be a big problem because inflation makes living harder, especially for people whose jobs don't increase wages in line with inflation. And it also erodes people's savings because your money is worth less. And again, we can go into a lot more detail here because, for example, the effects on savings also differ, because if your savings are stored in assets that go up in value when inflation increases, then you're fine. But only some groups of people tend to have these types of assets and savings. So you can also talk about the asymmetrical effects of inflation, right, as like another part of this analysis when you're making this argument in a debate, where usually less wealthy individuals can't protect themselves against inflation as well as more wealthy individuals and whatnot. And there's more and more and more, but that's not the core focus of this workshop. Though, of course, we'll have a Q&A at the end, so we can go wild there. The other thing that monetary policy does, so we've talked about interest rates. The other thing it can do is change the money supply in the economy. So you may have heard about a term called quantitative easing. That just means pumping money in the economy. The central bank usually does this by like figuratively / literally printing money and using that to, for example, buy government bonds and other and other assets to increase the supply of money in the economy. And that has basically the exact same effect as lowering interest rates. So when you're thinking about this in the context of debate, lowering interest rates and printing more money do basically the same thing. Then monetary policy also has a third function that is less talked about during debate, and that has to do with exchange rates here. And we'll talk about this a bit more as well. And that is to do with purchasing foreign currency. So each central bank has something called foreign reserves, where they buy foreign currency and they store a decent amount of foreign currency, and they do this to affect exchange rates. And there can be a bunch of different reasons for this. Maybe you don't want your exchange rate to depreciate, your currency to depreciate, because that will make your imports more expensive. Right? And so as a consequence of this, you might want to intervene and buy and use the foreign currency that you own and buy up a bunch of your own currency to kind of increase the demand for your own currency, and that increases its value and kind of props it up. Or on the other hand, maybe you want your currency to go down in value, to depreciate, because that helps your exports. Why? Because if your currency is worth less, which means for, say the pound depreciates against the dollar. So now for £1, you can get $1.1, but just $1. And you have a product that costs £1, then when you sell it to the US, it costs $1.1 there initially. But if your pound goes down in value, so for £1, you only get $1, that product now costs only $1 in the US, right? So when your currency goes down in value, your exports become cheaper in the other currency. And that's great for your country's exporters, right? Because then they are more competitive, they'll sell more stuff, that generates more employment in the export industry, that helps people, those people have money, they spend more money, that helps your economy, blah, 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 blah. And the kind of beneficial cycles continue. So that also means your preferences with regards to your exchange rate and then how your monetary policy impacts your exchange rates depend on your trade, right? It depends if you're a country that exports mostly or if you're a country that imports mostly, because then you also have different preferences for the levels of your currency. And if instead you are fine with your currency going down and that helping your exporters, but making your imports more expensive, or if on the other hand, you want your currency to go up in value and hurt your exporters, but make imports less expensive. And this depends on a bunch of other factors, right? Are you a country that focuses a lot on exporting natural resources or not? How integrated you are on the global markets, and all that. And of course, for each country, this is different. So to bring this back to debate, you want to, whenever you're having a debate, say, for example, on a currency union, and you want to talk about the pros and cons of that, it's a good idea to frame the economies of the countries in question to then highlight if them kind of losing some control over monetary policy, because that's what happens when you go into a currency union, right? All countries in the union only have one collective central bank. If that's good or a bad thing based on the economic composition of the countries. That's why, for example, currency union debates based around European countries might differ to currency union debates in countries in the African Union or in Latin America. And that's also a relatively important factor. And these are all things to think about that opening teams usually don't always catch, right? So it's kind of this more nuanced framing in these types of debates that's going to help you win from closing teams when you thought that opening took all of the usual kind of basic stuff that most people can think about. All right. I've kind of rambled a bit there, but to put this into context with a bit more structure. We'll talk about the direct mechanisms that affect currency movements. And we've got another question before that. So how do countries with smaller central banks use their policy effectively if big countries just have more capital to do more stuff? Great question. So the first thing to note is that when we're talking about big effect on global currency movements, we largely talk about big economies, right? You can't really say that Nigeria changing its oil exports will affect the value of the dollar by a large amount, because it won't, because the size of the economies is very, very different. So you usually want to talk about this in the context of the US, in the context of China, in the context of the European Union, or if you have a debate that's set regionally, so a debate that covers countries, say, in the African Union, then even though all of the countries in the African Union are small economically compared to global standards, as Africa has like less than 10% of the global GDP, right? Relatively to each other, they are very important. So it's about putting these things into context. However, exchange rates are always just about a pair of currencies, right? So when we say the dollar is going up, it means the dollar to British pound exchange rate, the dollar to the euro exchange rate, the dollar to whatever other currency exchange rate is changing. So that means even if you're a small country or a small economy, you can always affect the value of your own currency against the dollar quite a lot, because the market for your own currency against the dollar, again, is relatively smaller because your own economy is small. So even small countries can affect the movements of their own currency quite well. So I hope that answered the question. Very good question, by the way. Keep them coming. Okay, currency movements. So how does depreciation happen, right? What can make the value of your currency go down? Just to kind of map this out. And again, why is this useful for debate? Because if you know how this can happen, then if you want to make an argument that goes something like, if we do this, the currency will depreciate, and that's either good or bad for X, Y, Z reasons, these are the mechanisms you would focus on when you're trying to explain why a currency will depreciate. So the first thing that can cause depreciation of a currency are interest rate differentials. And that's why talking about monetary policy was very important for currency movements. By that, I mean, say one country, say there's two countries and they have the same interest rate in their economy, say like 3%. Then for some reason, the central bank of one of the countries increases its interest rate from 3 to 4 or 3 to 3.25, whatever. Suddenly, if you own the currency of the other country with the higher interest rate and you save that, you will get more money from that, right? Because now the interest rate is higher. So that means you probably want to buy that other currency to be able to save it and get higher returns from it when you save it. So if one country increases its interest rate, what tends to happen is the currency of the other country that kept its interest rate steady will depreciate. Or conversely, if a country decreases its interest rate, if the central bank in the country decreases its interest rate, you would see its currency also depreciate, right? Because now holding that currency will give you less returns, so you want to hold other currencies that give you more return. Another thing are inflation expectations. So if you believe that the one country will have high inflation, which means, the price levels will be increasing, which means the value of you having that currency will go down, then you don't want to have that currency, right? If you know that in like a year, everything will cost twice as much if the inflation is 100%, and it's going to be kind of useless, then you don't want to have that currency and you're going to sell that currency, right? To get rid of it very quickly. So if you believe that a country will have high levels of inflation, what tends to happen is the currency of that country will also depreciate quite quickly. A lack of faith in the economy. So if you believe as an investor, because most of these kind of big currency movements happen due to trade and due to investors acting on these types of signals. If you have a lack of faith in an economy and you believe, therefore, investing in that economy doesn't make sense, therefore holding currency of that economy also doesn't make sense because you don't want to use it, then that also tends to lead to depreciation of that economy's currency. Or then literally anything else that changes the supply or demand for either of the currencies in the currency pair, right? So supply and demand kind of is everywhere in economics. It's not just to do with product. It also has to do with currencies. So anything that increases the demand for your currency leads to it appreciating. Anything that decreases the demand for your currency leads to it depreciating. Then kind of with deep, right, effects of depreciation. We'll talk about that first. So why do we care about this? Why are currency movements even important? Firstly, your exports become more competitive. So we've talked about that before when we were talking about how if something costs £1 to produce and if your exchange rate for dollar to pound is you get $1.1 for a pound. That means if it costs £1 to produce, that means it costs $1.1 to produce. And then if the pound goes down in value, so say you can no longer get $1.1, you only get 1, then your product in dollars now only costs $1, right? Which means even though your actual costs didn't change, the value in another currency is now lower, which means you're now more competitive if you're an exporter. And this is quite important. For example, the US and China have had multiple disputes where China sells more to the US than the US sells to China. And the US has been accusing China a lot of manipulating their currency to artificially depreciate their currency to make their exports more competitive, to then sell even more to the US, right? And this has been kind of going on for way before Trump even came to the picture. Even the Obama administration was alleging that China is doing this. So that's one of the effects of depreciation. It helps your export industry grow. When your export industry grows, it employs more people. Those people have more money. They spend it in your economy, yada, yada, yada. That's great. On the other hand, your imports are more expensive, right? Because now you need more of your own currency to pay for another currency, which means kind of the opposite that happens with exports. Your imports now cost more. That can be an issue, especially if you're a country that is heavily reliant on imports. So some countries may need to import a lot of technology revolving around healthcare, or a lot of other technology that they're unable to produce themselves, or maybe food, because they're a country that is in maybe a very dry region and they don't produce a lot of their food and they import most of their food. Then if their currency depreciates, that leads to huge food inflation, and literally people die when that happens in many of these countries, right? Or if you import energy, right? and your currency depreciates, now suddenly, your oil, your gas imports are more expensive. That means energy is more expensive, and a bad winter comes, people die. And there's a bunch of different estimates on, for example, how many people died across the European Union just as a result of Russian oil and gas becoming more expensive, because a lot of people just couldn't heat their homes, and especially older people then, did not survive winters. So these are effects that should not be taken lightly, and it's important in the context of debates to always be able to bring the impact back to people on the ground, right? And to make it seem believable. So all of these things do affect people on the ground. They do affect people's livelihoods, people's quality of life, and sometimes people living or not living. Of course, with more expensive imports, you will get more inflation. That makes sense. But also, if your own export industry does better, right, which happens when your currency depreciates, people now have more money who work in that export industry, and they spend more money locally. That increases demand, and that also drives up inflation. So depreciation affects inflation in these two ways, not only through A, you import inflation, but also B, if you have a more competitive export industry, then that increases the demand in your economy, and that also creates more inflation. Again, that might not always be a bad thing. Inflation is not always a bad thing. Inflation in some moderate levels, 2 to 4%, or whatever the most recent consensus is a relatively good thing. Some countries even, in theory, need more. Or if your country is sliding into deflation, that tends to be very, very bad. Importing inflation, or kind of artificially creating some inflation through depreciating your currency, can also be a very good thing. We can, again, talk about why deflation is bad later, or if someone really wants to hear it, just ask and I'll explain. Now, we've talked about trade, right? All of this was about trade, the effects of depreciation on trade, and this lecture is currency, debt, and trade. So now comes the debt part. It's harder to repay debt in foreign currency, right? So if you're a country that has whatever currency and you borrowed a bunch of money from the US or from investors who want to be repaid back in dollars, because the dollar is the global currency, the most respected and trusted currency, at least in most places, then if the value of your currency is suddenly lower or reduced against the dollar, then you need more of your own currency to repay your dollar-denominated debt. So that literally increases your debt burden and makes it more difficult to repay your debt. And then the effects of appreciation, kind of take each of these 4 points and just flip them and do the work yourself. I won't bore you with this anymore. Cool. Now to apply this. Oh, I see a question in the chat. I assume this makes it harder for countries experiencing depreciation to secure IMF loans. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And this is, we'll talk about this in this application. So kind of, this is more relevant to what was happening a couple of years ago when the federal, when the Fed was raising interest rates, kind of after COVID subsided, when you had a large inflation in the US. The US was increasing interest rates, the Federal Reserve was increasing interest rates. This also happened in law during the 80s, when the US also had huge inflation, and under the central banker Paul Volcker, the US was increasing interest rates rapidly to combat that inflation, which caused kind of global debt crises for a lot of countries who owed debt to the US. So this is how to apply this to this specific case. And then we'll talk about how you can apply this to motions to be more concrete. when the Fed raises interest rates, the Fed is the central bank of the US, you get higher interest rates on the dollar. What happens? Firstly, countries with dollar-denominated debt with so-called flexible interest, that means the interest on your debt changes according to whatever the level of interest is in the US. For that, you use like this, you don't need for debates, but you use different like interest rate indices, like before it was LIBOR, now it's SOFR. You don't need to know that for debate ever, but just if you're interested how this happens in practice, usually link it to some interest rate index. Those countries will now have to repay more, right? If interest rates go up, now you need to repay more on your debt. And also it becomes more expensive to borrow if you do want to borrow, which also means your possible creditors, whether it be the IMF, whether it be countries, whether it be private investors, they're less also likely to lend money to you because they know that you'll now have to repay more and you might not be likely to repay that, and yada, yada, yada. So overall, your kind of fiscal policy, bringing this back to fiscal and monetary policy, your fiscal policy, because you need to usually borrow to spend, and also you need to repay your debt before you spend, will be constrained. You will not be able to do maybe tax cuts. You will not be able to do more spending on healthcare, on education, and all that stuff. But also the currencies of other countries, when you increase interest rates on the dollar, start to depreciate against the dollar. The currencies of other countries will depreciate against the dollar, which will import inflation. And we've talked about why that can be a bad thing, especially if inflation is high. And we've also talked about before how central banks, to combat inflation, they increase interest rates, right? That kind of depresses spending and therefore brings price levels down. So what happens is the US increases rates, your currency depreciates, your inflation increases, and your central bank starts reacting to this by increasing interest rates of their own. And that can slow your economic growth, put people out of jobs, or in some cases even cause mild recessions, right? That is pretty bad for your country. So this is just the kind of direct interest rate aspect of this. Now, of course, the dollar will increase in value or appreciate against other currencies. That means a couple of things. A, more important inflation. So we've talked about the impacts of this here, but you can also talk about the other negatives of important inflation, like price levels rises, cost of living increases. People usually who are poor tend to be less insulated against that, and whatnot, and all of the negative effects of that. But also dollar-denominated debt gets more expensive for those other countries that do not use the dollar as their own currency. And that kind of compounds the effects we've seen here, where it becomes more difficult to repay your debt, but it also becomes more difficult to borrow, to spend more. And especially in the context of your country already, struggling with, for example, a recession or high unemployment, people will want to pressure the government to spend more, to generate jobs, to protect jobs. And if you can do this less well, because now your debt is more expensive, so you need to spend more money to repay your existing debt, and also you can't borrow as much because that's more expensive, then that constrains the ability of your own government to kind of deal with the economic damage of all of this. So kind of all of the points here are somewhat connected and start to compound each other. And then recessions tend to compound on themselves as well. By that, I mean, if people believe that countries globally will now struggle to repay their debt, will possibly go into, either like periods of lower growth or even recessions in some cases, then investors globally become afraid, right? And investors, when they're afraid, they will go to safe assets. And one of the safest assets in the world are US government bonds, which also means kind of money will start flowing out of these other countries and back into the US. And what happens when that happens is the value of the dollar increases again. And now we're at the kind of beginning of the cycle. So this is one kind of very long argument with a series of mechanisms, a bunch of impacts on a lot of different stakeholders that you can run to explain why a country that has such a huge power globally and whose currency is the globally most powerful currency, when that country increases interest rates, why that's a generally bad thing for the economy, or for the economies of other countries, namely. So that's one application. And you can use this in a bunch of different ways, right? You can maybe use this to frame out the current economic environment, right? And then from that, because still the US has relatively high interest rates, even though a cutting cycle has started, where they have started to cut interest rates, but now with Donald Trump wanting to lower taxes, wanting to cut immigration, wanting to impose tariffs, that will likely be inflationary, which means the Fed might have to either keep rates high or maybe increase them more to counteract that. So this analysis can still work even today. And then you can use this to frame out the kind of economic climate of the debate. And then from that, use it to maybe explain why, because of this, my opening team was, wasn't using the proper context, or maybe this fully washes out the top half of the debate because no team was engaging with this. Or maybe it means that countries are in very fragile points at this stage. So for example, if you've got a motion about some strict IMF conditions, you can say this is not the time to impose these strict IMF conditions because countries globally are already doing so bad. So this is not the time to be constraining their ability to deal with this crisis even more, right? You can use this in a bunch of different ways. Or if you're talking about, say, the reliance on the dollar versus the yuan, and a big part of the debate could be which of the two countries is likely to play around with its interest rates more in maybe less responsible ways, then this is the mechanization and the impacting to explain why this will be bad or good for countries globally. So those are kind of the applications of this. Now, currency union, how can you use all of this? So we've talked about before that you've got monetary and your fiscal policy, right? If you enter into a currency union, you effectively lose control of your monetary policy because there's only one central bank in the whole currency union, right? So countries that adopt the euro, the latest one was Croatia, are basically surrendering the control over their monetary policy, and the European Central Bank now controls that. That can be good, that also can be bad. However, your fiscal policy, your borrowing, spending, taxes, all that stuff, that still stays. So a big kind of aspect of any currency union debate is A, how important is it for countries to have their own monetary policy? And that depends a lot on also different framing. And then B, or two, how well can countries kind of do just with having fiscal policy, even if they surrender their monetary policy? And then where is fiscal policy also more or less effective is another aspect there. So we'll kind of delve into the details of this now. So say you're proposing or a currency union. What are kind of the common themes you will see there? The first thing will be stability. So if there's more countries having the same currency, that means it's more difficult to A, manipulate with that currency because the total volume is larger, so no single player can kind of manipulate with the markets, speculate on the market, or even if there's some like panic, it's not going to cause such huge movements because the overall volume is larger. But also, two, you have higher stability because you might have a bunch of different countries that have different economic sectors, which means even if, for example, the prices of oil go down, if most of the countries in the currency union aren't huge oil importers or aren't huge oil exporters, then that's not going to have such a huge effect on the movements of the currency, right? Whereas comparatively, if you're just a country with your own currency and you're super dependent on oil, either because you're a big importer or a big exporter, then the movements of that will affect your currency a lot, and therefore your currency is less stable, right? So there's a bunch of reasons why currency unions tend to have more stable currencies, so the movement is lower, less volatility. That is good because it does it helps with predictability for investment, right? When I choose to invest into your country, when I choose to run a bunch of businesses in your country, when I choose to expand there, and I need to balance out the currency risk of doing that and of being exposed to these currency movements. If I know that your currency is likely to be way more predictable, then I am more likely to want to invest into your country, and therefore you get more foreign investment, and then you can talk about how this is a great thing for generating jobs, for bringing insight, for making your country more competitive, which also puts more pressure on your domestic companies to innovate more, blah, 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 a bunch of benefits from that. You also can get cheaper borrowing as a member country of a currency union. Why? Because another part of stability is that you know that the central bank of your kind of big currency union will do anything to make sure the currency union survives, because that's the whole purpose of the central bank. Which means if any single country were to, for example, default on its debt, there's a good chance that somehow either the central bank of the currency union or other countries of the currency union will step in to bail that country out, because the fall of one country can be hugely detrimental for the entire currency union. We've seen that happen with Greece during the Eurozone crisis. Probably it happened, or it will happen again in the future if something like that is likely to happen again. Because of this, when you're borrowing money as a country in this currency union, investors know that you are always likely to repay them, because even if you somehow mess up, mismanage your finances, or if you're hit with some bad economic shock and you can't repay, the central bank of the currency union or other countries in the currency union will somehow step in. And because of that, lending money to you isn't as risky, which means investors don't need you to pay them as big of an interest rate for this, because they're taking less risk by lending you money. So borrowing for you is cheaper. That means that, and this is an important preemption, because when you're talking about being a member of a currency union, the opposing teams will always say, but you surrender your monetary policy. Your monetary policy is important for a bunch of stuff. Just having your fiscal policy isn't enough. This already is a preemption for that, because you explain why, due to you being a member of a currency union, your own fiscal policy can do more things now, because it can borrow for cheaper, which means it can borrow more, which means it can repay less, which means it has more freedom to do stuff like spend, cut taxes, etc., etc. Exchange costs, this is like very small, but there's costs that come with exchanging currencies. You eliminate all of that. That can be quite relevant for people if they want to travel within a currency union, but relatively small. Price comparisons become easier. Again, this is more with regards to people purchasing things within the currency union. Tourism increases as a consequence of these 2 points. Then you can explain all of the benefits that stem from tourism for the economy. And you can also talk about technocratic central banking. So the kind of gist of this argument, of course, in the debate, we want to talk about this more. But the gist of this argument is that it's probably better for some more rogue countries within the Eurozone if they leave more of their monetary policy management to the Germans, basically. Not really, but more or less, right? You are likely to have a better quality of central banking because you will only have the best of the best from the entire monetary union having control over where your monetary policy goes. And maybe individually, some countries would just not do as good of a job there. But the collective kind of brain power, I guess, of the best central bankers from each country being in this one central institution will lead to better, more educated, more long-termist decisions. This argument is a bit riskier, I would say. Some judges might not listen to this as much, so kind of use this if you have nothing else to go on. Op. So this is kind of the go-to argument of any opposing team with a monetary union debate or a currency union debate, where you lose control over your monetary policy, and that can be bad when some countries need interest rates to go up and other countries need interest rates to go down. You can never do both. You've just got one interest rate in the whole union, right? That can be quite bad if you have something called an asymmetric shock happens. So say, for example, one country is very reliant on a certain sector, another country is very reliant on a different sector, and then one of those sectors does really well, which means one of those countries is like exporting a lot, its inflation is increasing, its employment is great, almost like most people in the economy are employed, and actually the demand is now too high and it needs lower inflation because demand causes inflation. It now needs inflation to go lower, which means that this country needs interest rates to go up. Say another country, which is reliant on exporting something else, has had a huge shock in this sector. Now it is exporting very little. It is struggling with very low inflation or even possibly deflation. It needs more employment. It needs lower interest rates to be able to achieve that, right? Because we've talked about how lower interest rates stimulate demand and supply. So it needs the central bank to lower interest rates. Now you can satisfy both with, the central bank doing one or the other with interest rates. So what happens in this case is something called an asymmetric shock, where you will, by increasing or lowering interest rates, end up benefiting some country and hurting some other country, almost always. And that can be quite detrimental. You can explain why maybe more powerful economies are likely to have more sway over the central bank in the currency union. So it's going to be the smaller countries that are going to suffer from this. Or you can frame out why this specific currency union will not work because every country is dependent on something else. This is good framing to use for currency unions in the African Union, because you can do a lot of framing on how a lot of the countries are export oriented, but each of them maybe exports a different natural resource, which means, and again, this is a very big generalization, but broadly you can say this, which then means that one of their sectors can be hit, another sector can benefit, and that exactly creates kind of this conundrum where you will need to increase interest rates or decrease them, but you can only do one or the other. And some countries will inevitably suffer as a consequence of this. And then you can talk about how, and then you can talk about how comparatively, if there was no currency union, if each of these countries had their own more monetary policy, then what they could do instead is the country that is experiencing high inflation, they're going to lower their interest rates. The country that is they're going to increase their interest rates. The country that is experiencing possible deflation, high unemployment, they're going to decrease their interest rates, right, to stimulate their economy. You can do this in a monetary union. Talk about lack of faith. with rogue countries. So you can explain how the presence of some countries who don't manage their finances well, who will constantly need to be bailed out, will decrease faith in the currency union as a whole. You can even explain how the existence of the currency union encourages this rogue behavior, because if a country knows that it's going to be bailed out, then it might act irresponsibly because it knows there's going to be less negative consequences from acting irresponsibly. Yeah, that's this point here. And lastly, and this is not mentioned as often, but I would say this might even be a stronger point than the asymmetric shocks point, is you lose a natural balancing mechanism between the countries in the currency union. So normally, if you have two countries trading and one of them has a trade deficit, which means it's spending more on imports than it's getting from exports, what this leads to is the currency of the country that's spending more on imports will start to depreciate because there's less demand for its currency than the currency it's supplying, because you spend on its currency when you buy its exports, but the country sells its currency when it buys the imports. So there's less demand for its currency. That causes its currency to depreciate. That make its exports more competitive and its imports more expensive, which means suddenly the trade deficit should narrow, right? As a consequence of this, because now it sells more exports and it buys less imports. And that this should kind of balance this issue out, right? Over the long term, of course. And this is a very important mechanism for countries that trade. And it reduces deficits, it reduces surpluses, and of course, prolonged deficits are very bad because you will need to eventually borrow money to pay for all of these extra imports that you're getting, and that can be problematic or unsustainable long term. So you can talk about how when both of the countries have the same currency in this issue, then this mechanism doesn't exist anymore, right? Trade deficits will remain, or at least they will not be corrected by this mechanism, which can lead to long-term unsustainable deficits with one country being worse off. So that's another argument that you can run. And again, you can weigh this argument quite a lot. You can talk about the long-term impacts of this and then how that can lead to the union fracturing and whatnot. But you will get, but you can kind of use this argument from a closing team and even beat your opening if your opening uses these two arguments, if you do proper weighing with that argument. We've got a question. Can the currency union weaponize its monetary control in any way against rogue countries? Definitely. It can also reduce its likelihood to bail out, but it can also say that, look, we know you now need lower interest rates because of this, because you were being rogue and whatnot. We will not do this for you, right? It can definitely claim to do this. The question is, will it actually do this? Who knows? But yeah, definitely it can. In terms of losing faith, has a currency union ever collapsed before, and what are the barriers that need to be met for it to collapse / for people to leave? So I'll say I have no clue if a currency union ever collapsed before. I mean, definitely it must have in the past. I just don't know of it. So might be some Googling on both our ends to do there. The barriers will depend, I guess, from currency union to currency union. So leaving the currency union, there's going to be a lot of administrative stuff, a lot of costs of phasing out the currency. It's going to take a lot of time, setting up new institutions, breaking a bunch of linkages that you've had to the countries in the currency union, and also having to deal with all of the backlash because the countries in the currency union probably don't want you to leave. So you can talk about all of that. And then joining a currency union, that again, that depends currency union to currency union. But for example, the Eurozone has, I think, 3 or 4 rules for countries to join it. that have to do with A, your debt to GDP being a specific ratio. I think that's 60%. B, your government spending deficit to not be larger than some percentage. I think that's 3, but not fully sure. And then C, it's your currency to not fluctuate against the euro by some percentage again. Pretty sure these are still the 3, but the last time I checked this was like 9 years ago, so who knows? But those are, for example, the conditions to join the Eurozone. And again, you can use this to model how currency unions can look for other groups of countries. Right. This took a bit longer than I thought. We have 12 minutes. So we'll run through this very, very quickly. 2 extra concepts, very useful. A lot of people don't know about them. Very good to use as a closing team in these kinds of debates. Firstly, the Dutch disease. Secondly, the crowding out effect. We'll actually start with the crowding out effect because it's more important. The Dutch disease is very, very niche. But the crowding out effect occurs when a country that is very important globally borrows a lot of money, which in turn drives interest rates up, and that kind of reduces all of the effect that you wanted to achieve by borrowing the money in the first place. So to put this to context, when countries borrow money, they usually do this to spend the money, right? Because maybe they're in some economic crisis and they need to boost spending, they need to boost demand, and that helps the economy, employment, and everything else. When you borrow a lot of money as a government, what can happen, especially if you're a big government, is now that you're kind of telling investors, okay, I need you to give me more money, the investors might suddenly say, but now you're borrowing more. Maybe we don't trust you with repaying us as much. Or I as an investor can invest into a lot of other things. So why should I give you money now that you need more of it? Which means the governments will have to promise them to give them a higher interest rate when they borrow more. When there is a higher interest rate on government debt, on government bonds, that usually means that because government bonds are perceived to be relatively less risky than any other forms of debt, it means that interest rates in every other area of the economy are also likely to go up, because now when companies are borrowing money, investors are like, hey, but look, the governments are now paying us more than they used to, which means you need to pay us more than you used to. Otherwise, this isn't worth it for us anymore, right? So interest rates in the whole economy can increase when governments start to borrow a lot. This is mostly relevant to like big economies. And we've already explained what happens when interest rates go up, right? When interest rates go up, companies don't want to borrow, people don't want to borrow, and companies and people want to save instead. So you as a country had an economic problem. You try to resolve it by borrowing money to spend more. But now what happens is, because you borrowed money, interest rates went up, which actually reduced spending. And it's called the crowding out effect because you borrowing and that increase in interest rates crowded out your investment as the government, right? Why is this important? It can be important for motions like this. And this was a motion in the European Debate Championship in the semifinals. And the specific semifinals that I watched, the specific room, they did not mention this argument. And I think one of the closing teams, what was this? This would be CG. CG could have capitalized a lot by using this argument, and possibly they could have gone through, but they didn't in the actual debate. Where you explain that deficit financing just means borrowing to spend, causes the crowding out effect, and essentially contradicts itself, which means any benefit that opposition teams talk about with regards to this promoting jobs growth, yada, 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 is significantly mitigated. And then you can weigh other arguments that you've brought in against this newly mitigated arguments from the opposition teams in this context. So that's one application. I see a message in the chat. What is a bond? Oh yeah, I never explained that. Good point. So a bond is just debt. So anyone can issue a bond. A government can issue a bond. A company can issue a bond. What it says is, or you can, so a government can issue a bond and people can purchase the bond. So if I, for example, purchase a government bond, that bond can say, I'm going to, the government's going to repay me in 1 year, and it's going to repay me with 5% interest, which means as long as I hold the bond in 1 year, say I paid $100 for the bond, in 1 year, the government's going to give me $105. Or what usually happens is your payments on your bonds are semi-annual, which means the government's going to pay me, if it's a bond that's worth $100 and it's a 5% interest bond and the payments are semi-annual, it means in 6 months I get $2.50, and then in the next 6 months I get $100 plus the additional $2.50. So a bond just is an asset that when I buy, I am, or whoever issued it is obliged to pay me whatever it says on the bond. And a company can also issue a bond, right? A company can say, we're issuing these bonds, please buy them. And so you buy the bonds, and then in however many years, the company pays you back however much it says on the bond. And in the meantime, of course, the hope is that the company will use this money that you gave it, that you lent to it, to kind of generate more money with, whatever companies do to generate more money. Bonds. So do bonds have variable or set interest rates? Great question. It depends. Some bonds have set interest rates. Some bonds have variable interest rates. So some bonds can just have a fixed rate of whatever percentage point. Some bonds can have a fixed rate of, say, some interest rate index plus an extra percentage point on top of that. And that's when I said before, where do we have this? Here, countries with dollar-denominated debt with flexible interest. So if it's fixed or if it's flexible in this case, they will see when interest rates change, their interest changes as well, right? And overall, like any form of debt can have fixed or flexible interest. For example, mortgages in the US tend to have fixed interest rates for, decades. Mortgages in the UK tend to only fix their interest rates for a couple of years, which means interest rate increases in the UK tend to more quickly affect people's mortgage payment than similar increases in the US. Also a fun fact here. All right. We can go through the Dutch disease in the next 5 minutes, but also if you have any questions, please post them, and I'll rather answer the questions than this, because this is very, very niche. But relating this to trade and exchange rates, right? We understand how if you export a lot, the demand for your currency is higher, that leads to your currency appreciating, and that reduces the competitiveness of your export, right? We're familiar with this mechanism. We've mentioned it a couple of times. The Dutch disease occurs when a country is exporting a lot. It usually happens when it's exporting some natural resource that it has a lot of. So for example, if you're exporting a lot of oil, or it happens to the Netherlands with tulips, you export a lot of this natural resource. So your exports are huge, which means people buy a lot of your currency to pay for the export. That means your currency appreciates. That means your export suddenly cost more, right, in the foreign currencies. And that can hurt your export industries. It will probably not hurt your main natural resource export as much, because oil will always, or almost always be super worth it to export, even if your currency appreciates a little bit. but it's gonna hurt or kill your other industries, your other export industries that rely or that aren't as greatly competitive, right? So it's basically when countries export a lot of oil, what can happen is their other industries, their other export industries are usually hurt by this because their currency will appreciate and the other export industries become less competitive and they kind of die off. And that reinforces itself, right? Then you have more focus on oil because there's even less of other things that you can export. And that kind of brings you back to the start of the cycle. Why is this important? For example, this motion where resource-rich developing nations could restrict extraction and sale of resources. You know, top half will talk about the environment, top half might talk about whatever else. You can say from closing government, the problem with this is the Dutch disease, which will lead to killing other export industries and reinforcing your dependence on oil or whatever other resource you're exporting. And then, of course, you can explain how that actually help to solidify or give weight behind the impact that your opening is talking about, because your opening never proved why you are likely to continuously export only this resource in the long term, right? But only you as closing government have now done this job for them. Therefore, you take over them because you explain why all of their impacts actually have longevity to them. So that's one application of this. All right, it's 34 past, so that's it for us. I would like to thank everyone for coming. I'm stopping the recording now.